What's up, it's Mike, and welcome back to the Spike Scale, the tier list that has never been wrong once ever. And today, we will be putting all of the MCU movies on a tier list. Now, I am a giant MCU nut. I absolutely love the MCU. I remember back in 2008 when I sat in the movie theater and watched the first Iron Man for the first time. It was a magical experience watching that Iron Man movie. And seeing what grew out of it was also just absolutely crazy. I have kept up with it all the years. I haven't missed a single movie when it hit theaters. So I'd like to think I'm a pretty decent fan of the MCU and know a pretty decent good amount of MCU stuff. But this time we're actually going to do the tier list a little bit differently. I actually already recorded this video and already did a run through of it where I did it the exact same style as I did the first Spike Scale episode with the 3D Mario games. But the issue I ran into is when I would drag each movie up onto the tier list and then talk a little bit about it, I realized I was saying a lot of the same thing. Because while don't get me wrong, the Marvel movies are very fun to watch, each in their own different ways, except for Thor: The Dark World, obviously. They all are kind of samey. They all kind of have the same tropes, the same kind of stuff going on. So what I'm gonna do this time to make it a little more interesting, I think, I'm just gonna make the tier list. I'm just gonna make it straight up, and then after I'm done making the tier list, I'm gonna go through it, talk about why I put the movies where I put them, and talk about some of the specific movies that I really enjoyed or really didn't enjoy, Thor: The Dark World, out of the MCU movies. So let me go make the tier list, and I'll be right back.
Hey, quick editor's note. So I made this video before I watched Shang-Chi, and after watching Shang-Chi, I would definitely put this movie at the top of A tier. It wasn't an S tier Marvel movie for me, but it's definitely one of the better Marvel movies I've seen in recent times. Okay, back to the video.
Alright guys, so I finally finished the tier list. This is my finished list of the Marvel movies. If you just come to these Spike Scale episodes to see the tier list at the end, there you go. I won't even make you skip to the end. You can go now if you hate the sound of my voice or something like that. But anyways, here's my completed list. I think this probably is the best list I'm gonna have. I really like how this one turned out. It actually took me a little bit longer to think about than I thought it would, but when we get into the discussion of some of the specific ones, let's start at the bottom first. So the Hulk movie, I've never actually seen it. I've heard some good things about the Hulk movie, but I've heard a lot more bad things about the Hulk movie, don't get me wrong. But I personally haven't seen it before, so I can't comment on it, so that's going in the Mike haven't watched tier. Now let's go over to the Mike Hike tier, where its lone resident is Thor: The Dark World. Thor: The Dark World commits the cardinal sin of being boring. I was almost never engaged watching this movie. It was just, I was put to sleep watching this movie, bro. I hated Thor: The Dark World. By far my least favorite MCU movie. Going up to the Mike Dislike tier, where obviously, as you can tell, I cannot spell, there's Ant-Man and the Wasp, Iron Man 2, and Thor. These movies aren't necessarily bad. I just don't like them for one reason or another. Personally, I don't like Thor 1. I think Thor 1 is really slow, especially near the beginning and middle of the movie. It's extremely slow. Iron Man 2 is just a completely forgettable follow-up to the first Iron Man. I don't think Iron Man 2 is per se a bad movie. It's just forgettable to a fault. And then Ant-Man and the Wasp, same case. I don't remember a single thing that happened in this movie, and I watched Ant-Man and the Wasp more recently than some of the other movies on this list, actually. Can't remember a single, I could not tell you who the villain was, what the plot was, or anything. This movie is just completely forgettable. Now the Mike kind of like tier, these are the movies that I'll watch more than once, but probably not more than that. I'll probably watch it once or twice, and it's okay. Now, you might be surprised to see the first Avengers movie in the Mike kind of like tier, but I gotta be honest, I don't think it's held up all too well over the years, especially with some of the later Avengers movies. I think the Joss Whedon version of these characters that are portrayed in Avengers are extremely stiff. They're archetypes to a fault, I think. And I think if the characters were allowed to be a little more loose, I think the movie would have stood the test of time more. Now, granted, it's not a bad movie. I think it's totally fine nowadays. Back in the day, it was revolutionary, don't get me wrong. Nowadays, though, I think it's just an okay movie, you know, to look back on some of the history of the MCU, but it's not worth much more than that. Then you have Spider-Man Far From Home, which I think was a solid follow-up to Spider-Man Homecoming. I think it could have been done a little bit better, but I liked the addition of Mysterio. I really like the end credit scene. I can't wait to see what J. Jonah Jameson does now that he's in the MCU. Really excited to see that. Also really excited to see how the story kind of pans out with No Way Home coming this year too. I'll definitely be doing a Spike Seconds on that when that movie comes out, so make sure you sub so you don't miss that. And then other movies in the Mike Kinda Like tier, Doctor Strange. The special effects in this movie are amazing, but the characters in the movie are just kind of whatever. And then Avengers Age of Ultron was definitely more forgettable than an Avengers movie probably should be. Really wish they did a lot more with Ultron. I know in the comics, Ultron does a lot more like crazy stuff, and I kind of wish they explored him more here. I really wish they let Ultron come back. He's a really fascinating idea for a villain, and you could be so creative with Ultron, and I think they didn't really expand too much on him here, and I hope they do that in the future. Also, I will never forgive how they did my boy Quicksilver in this movie. Just killed him after one movie, didn't even do anything with him. He wasn't even that charismatic. Like, whatever. Hopefully, when the X-Men come into the MCU and that version of Quicksilver comes over, they use him a little bit better. Alright, now we're up into some of the big boys, the Mike Like tier. These are the movies that I've watched several times, and I could probably never get bored of them. The first Iron Man movie, actually, I watched it about 2.5 months ago or something like that, and while it didn't hold up as well as, or as perfectly as I thought it would, it's still an extremely good movie. The only real, like, harsh point of criticism I can point towards the first Iron Man movie, and also by extension most of the other Marvel movies, is that the villain is extremely weak. Basically just a guy in a big robot suit. That's it. Doesn't really have a ton of motivation for what he does and all of that stuff. So that's probably the weakest point of the first Iron Man movie, but other than that, the CGI for the time, great. The characters for the time, Robert Downey Jr. here, Tony Stark. You guys know how good Robert Downey Jr. is at Tony Stark, but he nailed it from movie one. He was going crazy, and you know, I've loved most of the characters, again, minus the villain in this movie. And yeah, this movie still hold up surprisingly well. And then you also have Thor Ragnarok in this tier, the only Thor movie I genuinely enjoyed. Because usually, you know, the DC movies, you know how the DC movies are generally known for their, like, grayer tone just across the board, while the Marvel movies are usually generalized as more, like, lighthearted and all that stuff. I think the issue was the first two Thor movies were a bit too gritty for the usual Marvel thing. I mean, obviously, the first two Thor movies had a lot worse issues. Like, the first Thor movie made me scared of Dutch Angle. Every time I see a Dutch Angle now, I'm shaking in my seat. Like, I hate those things. But the first two Thor movies were kind of gritty, and I think that Thor Ragnarok finally brought that Marvel lightheartedness into the Thor series, and it does an excellent job at that. I love Tom Hiddleston as Loki in this movie. Chris Hemsworth also does a great job. Again, the other issue is kind of a weak villain. I will say the one thing about Hela, though, is they really do display her power. She actually does feel a lot stronger than Thor and Loki does, and they excellently show that off in that scene where she breaks Thor's hammer. I think that was a really well done scene to help display how powerful she is. And while outside of her power, she doesn't have much of a whole character going on, it's still cool that they at least have that going for her. And also the way they deal with Hela at the end of the movie is extremely creative, and I really like how they did it. Iron Man 3. This is a movie I personally love. Iron Man 3 is my favorite out of the entire Iron Man trilogy. And while there are definitely some cheesy parts in Iron Man 3, I absolutely love the ending fight. The ending fight where Tony Stark's just going through all of his Iron Man suits is just absolutely amazing. Seeing all the suits work together and all of that stuff, it was amazing to watch. It was an absolutely cinematic conclusion, and I loved that for Tony Stark's story. Again, definitely don't get me wrong, there are definitely some low points and some weird points in Iron Man 3, but I could not get over how good the ending to this movie was. Absolutely fantastic. And overall, the jokes land, Robert Downey Jr. kills it again, all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, That's why I have Iron Man 3 actually as high in my list as I do. I'm personally a huge fan of Iron Man 3. Another movie I'm also a giant fan of, Captain America the Winter Soldier. I could talk forever how good the fight scenes in this movie are. Each one is so well choreographed, and there's not as much CGI in this movie as there is in a lot of Marvel movies, at least in my opinion. A lot of these Marvel movies are just absolutely saturated with CGI, and while in some cases, like Doctor Strange, it can be a good thing, also, you know, sometimes I like a little more just like practical stuff, and I think Falcon and the Winter Soldier has the least amount of CGI. No, granted, it still definitely has a ton of CGI, but I think it has less CGI than some of the other Marvel movies do, and it really lends itself well here. The story this movie tells as well is also great, perfectly setting up Hydra and the MCU and have all that going forward, and completely changing Cap's character as he realizes that everything he's worked for was basically for nothing, and taking his character from there was an extremely interesting angle to go at. And again, the fight scenes are just amazing. Scarlett Johansson also does a great job as Black Widow in this movie. And also, the soundtrack is an unexpected hit here, too. It really makes you feel worried for the characters whenever the Winter Soldier is on screen. By the way, the Winter Soldier, Bucky, perfectly set up in this movie. Love how he's portrayed and all of that stuff. Captain America and the Winter Soldier is definitely my highest Marvel movie before I get to the ones that I absolutely love. Speaking of the Marvel movies I absolutely love, we are in the MikeSpike tier. These are the movies I could watch a billion times and never even get the tiniest bit old from it. It's also the movies that mean the most to me, not necessarily from an objective standpoint, but the movies up here mean a lot to me. Now we're going into the big hitters. Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Now, are these two movies objectively the best in the entire MCU? I don't think so. But these movies are way too important to not be in the top tier. Now, I think Avengers Infinity War is actually a better movie than Avengers Endgame. I think the pacing of Infinity War is on point. I think that it doesn't get cluttered, which, considering the amount of characters that are in this movie, is crazy that it doesn't feel cluttered at all. And this movie made me feel like so many different ways when I was in the movie theater watching it for the first time. I got to watch slowly as all of my favorite heroes that I've seen win countless times over the years, I saw them win over and over and over again. I got to watch all of my favorite heroes slowly lose. And watching that was magical. Again, I know it's a bit of a cliche term or a bit of a loose term, but it was magical actually watching all of the heroes just slowly lose. In that moment where Thanos snaps his fingers and Spider-Man starts not feeling too good. And then when the movie ended after that moment, I was like, wait, that's it? Like, where's the rest? Like, that's just the end of the movie? I remember me and my whole family just watching that movie being absolutely, dumbstruck at how Thanos he just won. Just as easy as that. Just got all the Infinity Stones and just won. It was crazy to watch. I think it was an amazingly well done movie. It was like, again, this sounds kind of cheesy, but it was like art piece of a movie. It was just so well done. And then I think Avengers Endgame, well, a little bit looser, a little bit rougher around the edges, a little bit not as clean as Infinity War. I think it concluded the story perfectly. I think there's probably not a better way you could have concluded this story. I think Avengers Endgame does a really good job at paying homage to some of the other movies, like the first Avengers. And I really love the scene between Tony Stark and his dad. That was a wonderful scene to watch from the perspective of a longtime fan. And all of the other references and what happened with Captain America's story, which led into the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series on Disney+. Avengers Endgame, while not as clean as Avengers Infinity War, perfect conclusion to the series. Now, there are only two movies I would put above Avengers Endgame. Those movies being the two Guardians movies. Now, personally, the first Guardians movie is my favorite. It is so rewatchable. I love the banter between all the different Guardians characters. I feel like the Guardians characters are the most well-written out of anybody in the MCU. I think their team dynamic is very interesting. I love Rocket. I love Groot. Peter Quill used to be my favorite protagonist and probably still is. extremely charismatic. Chris Pratt does an amazing job here. Gamora is also pretty funny, going from this like hardened like war criminal, I guess you could say, to like softening up over the course of the movie. It was actually kind of funny to see. So Guardians of the Galaxy is my favorite movie to rewatch. That's about it. But while I think subjectively Guardians 1 is my favorite movie, Guardians 2 is objectively the best movie in the entire MCU. Guardians of the Galaxy 2 does what a sequel should do and does it perfectly. All Guardians of the Galaxy 2 does is expand on what's already there. They just expand on Peter Quill's story, expand on Drax's story, Gamora's story. They expand everybody's story in this movie, and it's just so well done. The only tiny issue I have with this movie is, again, the villain isn't the hottest, but it's definitely better than most of the other MCU movies. The ending to this movie was the only movie that has ever made me cry before. The ending to this movie is absolutely beautiful, and everything leading up to it was stellar as well. And also, one thing I forgot to mention about the two Guardians movies, soundtracks absolutely slap. The first two Guardians movies, absolutely great. Can't wait to see where Volume 3 turns out. And that was my MCU tier list. If you feel like it's wrong, you can leave a comment, even though you're wrong, because this tier list has never once been wrong. And if you have any other suggestions to help improve kind of the format of this show, also leave a comment down below. And also, you can hit the subscribe button if you want to. Yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. See you in the next one. Peace out, everybody.